the ability to create a preservation, rescue, and storage plan. And then have an understanding of the unique preservation needs for various materials and different formats, and then just be aware of the tools that are available to you on this journey and process of preserving your family treasures. All right, so let's just dive right in. So like I said, there are some vocabulary and terminology that I like to cover. I use these terms every day, so I always have to remind myself not everyone's using these terms in the same way. So first, access, when you hear that term in like an archival setting, basically just mean who has the right to get access to the information to see it. For your personal collections, this could be, is it just family members that'll have access to the materials, or are you thinking maybe an institution will have access to these materials if you want to donate them down the line? So that's how we're using access. Appraisal, you may have heard, and it works pretty similarly. So that is getting basically an assessment of the materials in your collection, whether that is for monetary value or just historical value, getting a sense of what that could be quote unquote worth. Arrangement is a fancy archival word for how things are organized within a collection. And when we can, the original order of how items have been found, we like to preserve that. So I do, uniquely doing this presentation in the building I work in means I get to bring in materials. And you can actually see with some of the examples I have, and even online, you'll see examples of this. When you have like some sort of binder that someone put together and they donated those papers, when you can keep that order, that is really valuable. Sometimes you get like a big box of just stuff and it's just shuffled up papers and you're having to find order in it. But that original order of arrangement is a form of just organizing things. Conservation, and I'm gonna jump a little bit ahead to preservation because they kind of go hand in hand. Conservation is, one handy thing I was taught is conservation is like hitting rewind on an item. So if you have maybe like a painting that sustained some damage, you can work with a conservationist to actually have them restore that painting to the way it looked when it was first painted. Preservation is more just hitting pause. So if we know we have a piece of paper that's starting to show some signs of wear and tear, or if there's some breakage, we want to just pause that damage rather than trying to recreate that whole piece of paper necessarily. It'll be up to you how you want to proceed with that, and I'll talk about that later, but those two terms, that's how we're using those. Description is basically giving you an idea of what an item is. So you can say, I have a book in my collection. Great. What's the title? Who's the author? When was it maybe published? Who were the printers? That's the sort of additional information that can be really helpful for identifying the object. So when you're going through and describing like a photo, saying I have a photo is different than this is a black and white photo of this person on this date. So that description is really helpful because it goes right into that next word, which is metadata. Metadata is just data about data, which sounds redundant, but when you have a photo and you can have all that metadata, those descriptions, who's in the photo, who's those dates, that just gives the context for what someone's looking at and helps you again with telling that story. You have that information associated with that item. And then provenance, that's just a fancy name for saying we know where these items came from. So for example, our collections that we have here in special collections and take care of, we have a provenance record that tells us where the items came from. So for example, with the Poe collection, we have pieces of Edgar Allan Poe's hair. By having those provenance records, we can know and validate that it is pieces of Edgar Allan Poe's hair. So that's a fancy one. And respect to Hans is similar. Without going into much detail. So that's kind of the footing for the vocabulary. For family treasures, I always kind of like to start with these questions and goals because especially if you have a big pile of stuff or boxes of stuff and you're not quite sure what to do with those things, having these questions to guide you and being able to not necessarily have concrete answers, but have these questions going on just so you're aware of them can really help. So asking yourself, why do you want to save these family treasures? Is it for telling a story? Do you have an event coming up with your family that you want to share these resources at? Is it you want to pass it on to the next generation? Understanding, that why will help you navigate what steps you're going to take for preserving and caring for your family treasures. Because then that kind of goes into like who will need access, how you're going to preserve something. If just family members are getting access versus if you're going to send them to an institution can change how you're going to necessarily want to describe things or preserve things. How long will the records need to be stored or saved? That can be a big question. If you don't have an exact timeline, you're going to take maybe different steps to make sure you have that much longer preservation record. Will it be transferred? That's kind of going to those first two again of, if you are going to transfer them to an institution, you may not necessarily need to do all the heavy lifting on processing yourself, but it can definitely help the institution to make it more appealing to maybe receive those documents for them. And then what is the purpose? So that's going back to that first question of, why undertake this big project sometimes for some folks, especially if you have a lot of family records. But yeah, so answering those can just help guide you through your journey of preservation. So the fun part of what are family treasures? What do we mean when we talk about that? It can be all sorts of things. I like this photo because I do think it hits on a lot of different things. It can be tapes and newspapers and paintings and photographs and books and china and awards, letters, bound periodicals, photo negatives. The list goes on, quite literally. I could go through all these, but I won't. But these are just some examples of, things you might have around in your home, in maybe a grandparent's home, maybe another family member's home, that are storing a lot of historical materials, telling your family stories, all sorts of things. So you may think you have like this one folder of photographs and that's what you want to focus on. That's great, but you may have other things within your family's collections that could also really benefit and help give more context to things you're really emphasizing. So since there are so many different types of family treasures, and it can be a lot, I do always like to start, when you're doing this, one of the best things you can do for preserving and caring for your family treasures is just identifying and inventorying, making just that simple list of what it is you have. It can even, I like to use this image as an example because it can literally even just be a notebook that has some things listed, and if there's a numbering system that you develop, that works great, but any sort of inventory can really help, because doing this in an institution where it is just, here's a box of stuff and you have to figure things out, it can be really difficult, and the things you wanted to preserve and the story you wanted to tell may get lost if you don't have that sort of metadata of the inventory and what these things were. When it can be close in your family treasures, it allows you to kind of have that connection to the materials and give it that context so that when you're passing them on to the next generations, they can keep that context and keep telling that story. So as I say here, any inventory is better than none. So even if it's just, you have this many number of photographs, that just helps you keep track of things. And any description of items is better than absolutely none. So even the little things that you can do can just help pass on that story and help you keep track of what you're preserving as well. When I talk about like supplies, it'll be really handy to know just how many photo sleeves and folders you need to buy rather than buying a whole bunch and not necessarily using it all, or buying too few, especially if you're looking at archival supplies, because they can get quite expensive. And you can, like I said, you can use something as simple as a notebook, but there's also tools like, using Microsoft tools like Excel or Word. Google, you can use, Sheets or Docs if you want to have like a digital record that's easier to edit. This is where you can start beginning by creating that really valuable metadata. When you're doing the inventorying, I always stress it is important to note the format of the material and the items that you're keeping track of. I love using this example because this just comes from one of our collections. This physical folder and that digital folder have the exact same title to them. So, it can get confusing if you just say this folder with this title. Well, do you mean the physical one, or am I looking into the digital one? It's 2026, a lot of our records are gonna get blurred between physical and digital. I'll talk more about that in there. But your preservation needs and what you need to help protect those family treasures that you have will be largely dictated by the format of the material. So getting into the materials and formats. So when we're talking about physical materials, books are a big one. So we're thinking about, there's paper and pages that are gonna maybe need some attention. The bindings of books, they could have been stitched, they could have been glued, depending on how they were manufactured. Papers, that makes up a lot of family treasures and documents. We're looking at letters, legal documents, maybe there's some manuscripts, typescripts, handwritten notes, those sorts of things. I will talk about this several times, so I always like to keep this footnote in. When thinking about paper, it's good to know before the sort of rapid industrialization period, a lot of paper was made from like linen and rags. So the pulp was made from that, which they're actually much more stable pages. So paper from like 1850 is a lot more stable than paper from 1950. Once we hit the industrialization period and paper making switches from like the linen and rag pulp into wood pulp, The process for making wood pulp into paper involves a lot more chemicals, so it makes the paper a little unstable. So if you've seen like old sort of, pocket paperbacks from like the 70s that are super yellowed and brittled, that's from that super industrial paper that has a lot of just acidity in it, and it can just dry out and crack really easily. A lot of papers people have are kind of in that condition, so being able to control that brittleness is a little more sensitive with that post-industrial paper than the pre-industrial paper. Periodicals are a great example of this. So if you have a newspaper, even from like 2 years ago, you may see yellowing and that sort of breaking beginning. Periodicals like newspapers were just printed on that sort of less expensive paper because they were printed so regularly. Magazines, there's a whole host of different types of paper that they were printed on too. So whether it's that glossy or if it was like a more bound periodical, so different sort of things that you can see in that. Some other physical materials that you can think about, scrapbooks are extremely popular and really common items in a lot of people's family treasures. Those can include things like ephemera is just kind of a catch-all word of something that maybe wasn't intentionally made to be saved, but we held on to it. So like ticket stubs, I think, are a great example of that. A lot of people like to scrapbook with ticket stubs for events they went to and like keep it with the photos from that event, and they'll often end up in like one little scrapbook. Greeting cards and postcards are somewhat of an example of ephemera in that they weren't maybe necessarily meant to be saved, but they can tell us a lot. And, that one card that a family member sent to someone may have a lot of meaning to your family story. So saving those can be really important. Maps, I love maps personally, so I always love saving them. But if you have interesting maps for, let's say, where your family's house is located and someone mapped the geography of the area, you maybe want to save some of those. And this is probably the last bullet point is maybe what a lot of folks have, and I get a lot of questions on, which is photographs, how to preserve those, whether they're on film, daguerreotypes, tintypes, if it's photo negative, if they were printed in sort of, a darkroom setting, or if it's just printed from a printer. There's a whole lot of different types and all sorts of weeds you can get into with photographs of how you would preserve those, but also the types of photographs that exist. And kind of going from that, the audio-visual sort of material. So I think a lot of folks probably have boxes that look like that second picture of just VHS tape on VHS tapes or old cassette tapes and CDs. These can be treasure troves for family histories and things like that. And I'm sure, like I said, a lot of us have shoe boxes full of these. But it can get really complicated because cassette tapes versus DAT tapes are not necessarily the same and how you would preserve and process those. CDs versus, actual tape reels. Those are two different ways of handling things. And then video materials, again, a DVD versus Blu-ray, making sure you have the right machines that can play the right materials. And then finally, I also like to talk about, if your family has artwork that they have in their collections that have been passed down, whether they're paintings, if you have textiles like quilts, or if there's like a gown or some sort of uniform in a family's collection that wants to be saved. And then objects, glassware, china, ceramics, typewriters, that's from our H.L. Mencken collection. Those can all be just examples of physical items that you have. In addition, I think also today, now in 2026, a lot of us are generating a lot of family records digitally, especially if you have a phone with a camera built into it. You're probably creating a lot of digital family treasures that you're maybe not quite thinking about in the same way as you think about old photos. Because there is a difference between, a digitized item, an old photo that you scan to create a digital record of, and then born digital items. I think especially when thinking about like family photographs, so many of them are living digitally on our phones or on iPads and tablets. How you want to manage those and think about those, not just leave them in the like, oh yeah, I had those photos on my phone. Digital materials still need maintenance and care just like physical materials. So, like I mentioned, the difference between like digitized and born digital, some examples of born digital records that you'd want to think about when thinking about your family treasures include like Word documents, Excels, PDFs, those sorts of things. Digital images, like I mentioned, but like emails and texts could be saved, just like letters and cards. They may have very significant meaning. If you have a web page someone built, if there were a blog, social media post, digital recordings, whether they're video or audio, all kind of are in the sort of orbit of family treasures and things to think about worth preserving. So we've talked about the materials and what you might have in your collection. So what are they potentially at risk for? This is one of my anxiety slides, but this is just a kind of quick overview, look at, the sort of things that can unfortunately go wrong, whether the things break, whether you have tapes and the tapes get eaten out of the cassettes, books can fall apart, paintings can take damage, mold can grow, unfortunately. You see that brittle paper just breaking apart, so there are unfortunately a lot of risks and damages that can harm your family treasures, and I think it's worth taking time to think about these because maybe some folks don't always realize, you may think keeping something up in your attic is a good storage spot, but you're actually leaving your potentially very, valuable and really important materials to extreme risk. Common risks here to see water, fire, light, dirt, bugs and pests, just basic physical harm from, mishandling of materials. With digital, you can think about like file incompatibility issues. Like I said, if you have a DVD, but your player will only play Blu-ray, anything on that DVD might not be able to be transferred. And then file corruption and data loss. A lot of these risks apply to both. So, for example, with fire, if fire burns paper, we can't restore ash, unfortunately, but if you have fire and it burns, a hard drive, that can melt the internal circuits and you can't necessarily get the digital files off that hard drive anymore. So these risks apply to both. Excuse me. I do have a whole slide dedicated just to water because it is the most common culprit for damaging of materials. Excuse me, it's the most common culprit because it works basically against materials in two ways. You have just your basic environmental risk of humidity. If humidity gets too high, it's just a lot of moisture sitting with materials, and that's just a great place for mold to grow, unfortunately. And then you have the big emergency risks like big floods, you have a pipe burst, all of a sudden you have some leaks getting through. It can just do a lot of damage. It can crinkle paper, it can warp books. If you have prints or anything, it can dissolve inks. It can, alter the pigment tone of different things because it's just interacting with all the chemicals. If it was like dirty water, it'll leave residue on things. It can leave a lot of just unfortunate debris in items. Like I mentioned, it creates the perfect environment for mold and growths to go through a collection. And it can permanently damage electronics. You have a bunch of important files on a computer and someone dumps a big thing of water all over it, that can cause a lot of problems. The good news is there are ways to treat water damage. One really common way is just freezing the material, to be quite frank. And then you can use like desiccants to just rapidly evaporate out some of the moisture. Not always, it depends on the extent of the damage, but it's not all hope lost necessarily. Getting into some of the other ones, unfortunately it does. Fire, although not the most common, is the most destructive. Like I said, if something is just completely burned, unfortunately, there's not anything you can do. But smoke and soot can also do a lot of damage. So smoke damage to like photographs can leave sort of like a film on them because it'll adhere to like the chemicals in the photos if it was like a photo developed in a darkroom. And then soot can also leave behind just like grit and materials and things like that. Light damage is one that's very common, especially when you, like for museums, archives, when we're displaying materials. Oh, yeah. Minor technical. Thank you. Appreciate it. So I'll get back to light damage. For museums and archives, light damage is something we are very concerned with when we want to like display items. Light damage can add up over time. So even, sitting under light for 15 to 20 minutes when we have, for example, with our Poe collection, we have handwritten manuscripts in Poe's hand. The originals themselves are very sensitive, and we don't necessarily want to be exposing them to light all the time. So we'll do things like make facsimiles, because the facsimile can take light damage, and we can create another facsimile based off the digital file we have. But we can't create the original manuscript in Poe's hand from 1830s, 1840s. We just aren't going to be able to do that. Sun damage, indoor lights, camera flashes, these are all examples of light damage. So it's not just like your ambient lighting in a house or in a room. It can be any, leaving things out in the sun, or even when people want to take photos if that flash is really bright. Dirt is one I like to talk about because it can accumulate more than people realize. When you have a lot of just like grit and dirt in your materials, it can get in between the pages, and you can actually start getting some tears. Especially with textiles, dirt and grime can be really damaging because it's just in the fibers, and it can start to break things down. And it can also be, unfortunately, a way to attract pests, like bugs, anything like that. Because bugs and pests are not our friends, unfortunately. Bookworms and silverfish. This is an example of they'll just eat through pages. So if you have books or documents or anything like that, they'll just eat through it. It's great for them, I guess. Bed bugs and other small sort of little bugs that can kind of get in the cracks of books or in between pages, they'll just multiply and they can hop through all your pages, all your books. So you kind of want to be watching for that kind of stuff, and that's where that keeping things clean can make a really big difference, just keeping the pest out. And then also larger pests like rodents, they can leave droppings. They also will eat materials because to them it doesn't have that same sort of meaning that it has to you. Other risks, that physical harm and mishandling, this can be some of the most common just after water, I think. Just it happens, but sometimes it's just carelessness. If you have a book and you're just dropping it, or if you have, a bag and you just throw it down on the floor or something like that, well, if that bag had that hard drive with all the valuable and important files that you were saving, you could cause some serious damage and not necessarily be able to have access to those things. Improper shelving, too. I mean, I've seen a pin go out on a shelf and just everything falls off a shelf very suddenly, so that's not great. With textiles, too, little snags, little pulls, little slight tears here and there will add up over time to the point where you're ending up with a lot of damage to your physical materials. And then with digital, like I mentioned, water, light, fire, dirt, bugs, all that still applies. I used an example of a CD out here on the slide, so I think maybe some of us still have some files saved on CDs. If that CD breaks, there isn't necessarily a way to get it back together and get those files off. So you do want to be careful with that. But with digital, it can still apply to physical, but I think digital, we see it a lot more of incompatibility issues. Microfilm, microfiche, those sorts of things require really specialized equipment. If you have a bunch of VHSs, but you no longer have a functioning VHS player, you're having some incompatibility issues there. Software updates, though, is I think where it comes up the most. I mean, especially in 2026, we're seeing so many software changes, so many new devices coming out. It's creating a lot of different types of files that don't necessarily like to work together. We may not always be able to kind of fit them or convert them to ones that are a little more stable. The example I like to use for this is if anyone has an iPhone, you may have noticed when you take some photos, you get a different photo file type, which is like .heic or something like that. That doesn't always work as compatibly, that file type, with other programs. Like sometimes Microsoft Word can't import that image because it's just not compatible with those. And that's just one example. That can, happen in all sorts of different ways. And then another thing to think about with as a risk for digital is file corruption. When you're transferring data, updating things, anything like that, you do sometimes run the risk of the files just get corrupted and they can no longer be read by the computer itself. That can result in data loss. So I just introduced a whole bunch of anxieties, but what can be done there? There are ways to save the family treasures. So these are just some examples from our collection. Preserving photos with their letters in safe manners, encasing books, having appropriate boxes for storage, encasing things in Mylar. The digital example in that corner there is just showing that there's different ways you can save things to always give yourself basically an access door to digital files, whether it's going to be through a cloud or through a hard disk or through a disk. There's different ways to do that. So for saving your family treasures, I'll go through these in more details over the slides, but this is kind of the quick overview, more or less. So the first thing is knowing what you have, and that's where that inventory that I talked about at the front really comes in handy. Keeping that up to date and knowing just the materials you have will help you make these plans of how to be prepared and keeping your materials safe. Things won't just go missing if you're keeping that inventory up to date, hopefully. So be prepared, have a plan and a backup plan. I talked about the preservation and conservation differences. For your collection, you may find preserving the items is most appropriate, but you may find for some of the items it is worth going for conservation, restoring the items to their original condition. Once you've done those steps of like the preservation and conservation, you want to make sure you protect and secure that which you just put so much effort into preserving and conserving, and you want to make sure that those items are then stored safely. So for protecting and securing, you want to make sure the materials are housed appropriately and secured in stable environments, so stable shelving. And then with that, storing them safely, making sure they're in a responsible location, and then also making sure that you have enough space for the items if you ever need to add to the collection. When you have so many books and you're trying to shove so many all onto one shelf, you can run the risk of damage because that's kind of a mishandling. You're squishing things more. You run the risk of pulling one thing's going to pull multiple things, so you want to make sure you give yourself space. Measuring shelving is something we do quite often. So getting more into detail, so for saving your family treasures, having a plan while you're both in the process of getting your materials preserved and then also after you've completed that. Like have a plan of what you're going to prioritize in the conservation and preservation, and then developing an emergency response plan before an emergency happens, not in the middle of the emergency, and then having some sort of recovery plan after that emergency plan. I like to say have a backup plan, and it's a bit of a pun, because for backup plan, you want to back up your materials in any way you can. Creating these multiple versions, as long as you're marking in the metadata, which is the copy, which is the original, is a great way to ensure you always have some sort of at least representation of a material you had. So you can take, making physical and digital copies of photographs. You can do the same with like any paper documents. So I use this example. It's a little tough to see in the picture itself, but the original item is on thermal paper from an old fax machine. Thermal paper is, being thermal, very reactive to environmental temperatures, so it's really easy to lose material that was printed originally on thermal paper. It will just fade, just the way the paper was made. But if you catch it before that happens and make a copy onto more like office paper style that doesn't have that thermal reaction quality to it, you have a more stable backup version. And then with digital, backing up is a huge thing. You always want to be making sure you're backing up your files, both in a cloud and on a second disk, just to make sure you have access to things. If you do ever find yourself, though, in an emergency, like I said, if you've made your plan beforehand, using these resources when you're making that plan is really great, because you don't want to try to figure out what your emergency response plan if your basement all of a sudden looks like what's in that photograph of just water everywhere, paper turning back into mush, unfortunately. And I can send out these links, but they're basically from various institutions. They have more or less templates for you can print them up and walk yourself through them to help you plan through these sort of disaster scenarios. I have a bit of anxiety, so I always think through the disaster scenarios. But again, if they're your family treasures and you really want to preserve them and pass them on, it's good to have these plans associated with your collections. So when you're saving your family treasures, you do have to think about prioritization. You have to decide what needs the most immediate attention, what is really deteriorating quite rapidly. Do you have some photographs where you actively see them breaking down? Maybe those need attention before all the papers, because paper just with text and tends to be a little more stable, but it just depends on the nature of your collection. And then it also, in prioritizing, allows you to set what is your priority if an emergency happens. If you have that emergency, is it the photos you save first or is it the books you save first? Planning that out and setting those priorities before it happens allows you to react more immediately and get more likely to save your stuff. I talked about preservation and conservation pretty extensively, but I do want to point out, preservation is something that a lot of folks themselves can do. you may need specialized material, but not necessarily a specialist. Conservation, on the other hand, you will more likely need to work with some sort of third-party expert, especially with like paintings or anything of like really delicate nature. A conservationist may be worth it for you to work with. However, just be aware they can sometimes be a little costly. But again, that's up to you, and when you're setting those prioritizations, what you want to invest in, because again, there is a price tag with preservation. And with AV and any sort of digital materials, you can still talk about preservation and conservation, but this is really where you're probably going to need some sort of third-party help. We have a preservation station here that can help do some like home video conversion, but if you have a lot of video or audio material that is very rare and unique, you may want to work with like a local vendor who can take those tapes and use much more specialized machinery to get different quality of things. So just depends on what you have. Now, after you've made all these plans and set your priorities and done all that, you are going to kind of go into your supplies. When you're thinking about supplies to get, archival quality is going to be your standard that you want to look for. Like I mentioned, that just means of any sort of, anything related to archives. These are three that we've used, three vendors, so Gaylord Archival, University Products, and Archival Products. The big difference between like archival products and just your common supplies, because a lot of folks will use common supplies like folders, office printer, binders, just those plastic sleeve protectors that you can get from like a Staples or anything like that. And those are fine, but they don't necessarily have the longevity that the archival products are specifically designed for. I like to use these examples, and I can pass them around, but your regular plastics that you can get from like a Staples, you'll start to see some like discoloration on a lot of these, and it's just the polymers of the plastic breaking down. It's kind of an inevitable thing. There are oils used in the manufacturing, so as that breaks down, you have to think about that those things will start leaching into your materials. The archival quality Mylar that you'll see like archives and libraries and museums use doesn't have that, and so they are rated for different levels. So when you're shopping for these things, it's something to look for. Big things are, especially with paper, you want it to be acid-free, lignin-free, and dye-free, just because over time those dyes and things will kind of break down and get into your collection as well. Processing supplies, I would recommend having some gloves, whether it's cloth or nitrile, just because sometimes stuff gets a little gross, but also for the preservation and safety of the items, you do want to be wearing gloves. Not always, but sometimes. There are specialized stapler removers that can remove staples more carefully without damaging the materials. There are also specialized adhesive cleaners, and I'll get into, staples and adhesives can be kind of damaging for materials, especially paper. I only include like anything like X-Acto blades. Sometimes you do need to extract items out of a container if the container itself is starting to degrade and you're worried about that causing some issues. So, protecting the family treasures. Once you have your supplies, you can kind of start going through this action of actually processing the materials. So you want to protect the items. So storing any materials in like acid-free folders and boxes just helps keep them safe. Preservation materials serve as not just a protective barrier, but also support. So when you see, maybe one or two sheets in just one folder, the benefit of doing it that way is those papers aren't going to rub up against a whole bunch of other papers. If they're very fine papers like you see in this, giving them like that supportive backing with a heavier acid-free folder just keeps them from crumpling in on themselves or folding in on themselves or risking further damage. It works as, like I said, a support system and a protective system, because if something's in a folder and something spills on the folder, you can swap the folder. If it spills on the original, that's unfortunate. And then once you have them protected, you want to make sure you're storing the items safely, so in a stable environment that's also secure and then minimizes risks, and then making sure there's enough space, like I talked about. And then with digital protections, you want to make sure you have multiple formats in different locations, and sometimes it is worth looking into getting a really good cloud storage account of some sort with a lot of space for you to store things in the cloud. That way you always kind of have that remote access. So when I talk about stable environment, here's the optimal environment. So anywhere between 50 to 65 degrees, you can have some fluctuation, but in that range, most items are going to be pretty safe. There are some exceptions, like some really specific phototypes prefer much cooler storage. So whether it's 30 to 40 degrees, Some things can go even colder, but you don't necessarily want to get down into like the freezing range. Most stuff though, that 50 to 65 will stay pretty happy. And then that humidity range of 30 to 50%. If it gets too low, things can get a little too dry and you run that brittle risk. Way too much moisture, like we talked about, you get humidity and mold concerns. And then controlling the light as best you can, keeping low and direct light as best you can. And then whatever space you designate, you do want to assess for any potential risks, like water or pest. Generally, active lived-in spaces, so like a closet that you're in and out of and use a lot, that can actually be a lot safer than somewhere like your attic or basement. Attics aren't always sealed in the same way, so they are more exposed to environmental elements and more vulnerable to pests. And then basements pose probably the biggest flooding concern for the most part, but you also have that pest concern. And this is where I'm going to go more into how you actually kind of preserve the items. So for protecting your family treasures, when we talk about paper, I talked about that pre-industrial, which is actually very stable. Keeping pre-industrial individual sheets and folders is a really great way just to have them last. Compared to that post-industrial where you get much more fading and that brittleness. When you start seeing breakage in paper, that's where like the difference of that archival mylar can really come into handy, because paper, whenever you can keep it flat, that's your best way to preserve it. Folding paper creates the creases. It over time will create break points just because paper is still fiber, so when it's folded over like that, those fibers just wear out and you get the breaks. So whenever you can flatten a page, whether it's a big piece of paper, small, flatter is always going to be better, just keeping your page as more stable as you can. When you can safely remove fasteners, especially if they're metal ones, you do want to get those out of the collection. Metal fasteners will react to any humidity and moisture, so you can start getting rust. The rust can start eating through paper. Fasteners can also just create a rip point, so if you have staples in there and someone carelessly moves a piece of paper, they could rip that sheet because it has that anchor point. So removing fasteners when it can be done so safely is always recommended. Sometimes removing fasteners could actually damage the material, so you kind of have to look at each individual item and assess from there. I wish I had always do this thing, but each item is going to be quite unique. Whenever you can separate papers by just interfiling, whether it's like a crepe paper, sort of a thin tissue paper, or just even acid-free, lignin-free paper in between sheets, that'll help keep them last longer, because any of the ink that's on your originals, they can bleed into each other over time. Then you have to separate those and you run the risk of ink peeling. However, keeping the interfiled sheets helps prevent that, and because that other sheet can basically serve as like a buffer and help prevent that adhesion. Now, if you do have sheets that are falling apart, in the photo in the lower right, it's a little tricky to see, but for the folks who are here in person today, I did bring it out. You can actually see exactly where the break points are from the page being folded. Putting it into an archival polyester sort of mylar sheet, the static electricity of that will actually help keep the pages in exactly where they're at. So those 4 pieces that we had to put together, and locking it in that mylar, the static of that will keep it in place and prevent it from falling apart, deteriorating, losing a chunk of that, anything like that. For books, you're still going to be working with a lot of the same sort of paper concerns. You don't necessarily need to interfile paper in between each book page. That can get your book will get a lot fatter a lot quicker. The way books were printed, it's less of a concern compared to loose documents. But one thing to also think about with preserving books is any sort of bibliographic record or metadata. A lot of folks maybe have old books in their house, but they don't necessarily know what the book was. Printing and publication has changed over the years, so not all books have the same sort of colophon page with the publisher and date and all that sort of information. So if you can have that information with the book, that definitely helps it. Binding is something to think about with books, because not all books were bound in the same level of care. You can rebind books. It can be a little expensive, but it might be worth it. And then you can also, if you don't necessarily want to go the rebinding route, you can encapsulate them. And these are just some examples of how, using some archival quality stocks, you can fold a book together so you have basically this sort of little box for the book to help keep it safe. So it really just depends on the book, level of damage, what you need to preserve that for. For periodicals, newspapers are a very popular thing people have saved, especially if there was family member who had an article about them or anything like that. These can be very difficult to preserve just by the nature of how they were made. The really thin paper that kind of disintegrates kind of easily. The inks weren't necessarily made to last, and they're very sensitive to light damage. They'll just kind of react much more quickly. You can preserve the originals by encapsulating them with Mylar, keeping them closed like that. But I do tend to recommend, if you can make any sort of copy, it is well worth it, whether it's taking a picture of it and having a digital one, or even just running a basic paper copy on a copier. The office paper is even going to be a lot more stable than newspaper, so you'll at least have the text in there, because as the text starts to fade, it might be hard to still read it, but if you have that representation version, you can still refer back to it. And then with newspapers, it is really whenever you can separate the pages with additional paper, because they will, should have brought an example, but you may even find in going through, you'll have like a piece of paper that had some newspaper sitting on it, and you'll see the exact outline of where that newspaper was sitting, just from the acid of that newspaper bleeding through into the other page. So whenever you can separate those, that's just putting a buffered sheet, let that take the acid, and then if you need to in 20 years, you can swap that out, and you can just have that buffer paper be what's taking the hit, not the original document. And yeah, so like I already said, digitizing or making that alternate version can really help with that. I talked about scrapbooks earlier, and I'll talk about them a little bit more again, because again, they tend to be very popular items in family treasures. But they can kind of be a big head scratcher, and you may be employing multiple forms of preservation techniques. You may need to be preserving newspapers, as you see in there, but you may also be preserving letters. You may be preserving photographs. You may be preserving, so you're working with a lot of different materials within one container. So you're going to have to use a lot of different strategies sometimes. Generally, adhesives are the biggest struggle with scrapbooks when things have been glued into things. Depending on what glue was used, it can either be really damaging or harmless. Sometimes glue dries out within 10 years and stuff's just popping off the page anyway, so you can take, for example, like a photograph. You can just take that photograph off, preserve it. You don't have to necessarily worry about that because the adhesive kind of dried itself out. Others are much more robust, and sometimes whatever is glued in is stuck there because you don't necessarily want to try to remove something if it's going to cause damage. If you go to try to remove something and if there's any sort of ripping, just stop yourself. It's not worth risking that rip in favor of getting it out from the adhesive. But if you can separate them from adhesives, that's great. If you can't, though, this is a great example. These are from the Pratt scrapbooks. It was just a lot of newspaper clippings all glued in on pages. You can actually, this is actually where you might be able to see that sort of bleed I was talking about. So you can actually kind of see where the newspaper outlines are from the other page on one page. But interfiling that page of that tissue paper to kind of absorb some of the acid bleed is just really going to help those last a lot longer before they all get digitized, because we're in the process of digitizing, but it takes time, and as that digitization is occurring, you still have those items sitting in that condition where they are running the risk of damage. This is another example of where you're seeing, and this, if you're here, you'll see it in person, of a whole mix of things. So we had letters in this, we had ID cards, driver's license, all sorts of different things. For some of the items that we couldn't remove, we simply left them. But we made copies of the original notebook, so you had that original order. Whenever you can pull things out, though, it is much more stable because the letters that can be stored in folders are going to have much more protection and care and be able to last longer than things that are just kind of stuck in there. We've made our copies, we've done what we can, but if we were trying to remove them, we run a big risk of damaging them. With cards and postcards, it's still a form of paper. They were designed to be folded, so they're a little more robust at those crease points, but it is still recommended, if you can, flatten them just so they can last a little longer. And then I would also recommend separating them, especially so like our historic greeting card collection. There are so many different types of papers and felts and all sorts of different materials, and you don't necessarily want those different materials rubbing up against each other, because one card was made to look one way and the other, if they start rubbing up against each other, you may have some issues. So separating them just with even just basic paper can make a big difference. And then maps and other large pages, whenever possible, just like with other paper, store them flat, but I understand that not everyone has the means and space to have big archival flat files in their homes. So your best next option would be to roll them up, because you're not creating those crease points. When you roll them, though, you definitely want to make sure you have some sort of lining paper because they can stick to themselves if they're wound up for a long time. This is especially true for like paintings. If someone made a painting and just rolled it up, the paints can start to stick to the paper, and it's really difficult to unroll that again. If you have items that were very tightly rolled and you're trying to go the opposite direction of flattening them, sometimes that is just time. You have to just let the paper loosen itself up. There are ways that they can treat paper with, introducing a little bit of humidity, but you have to do that in a very controlled way. And then photographs, because again, this is probably the one we get the most questions on. Whenever you're working with photographs, especially older photographs that were developed in film rooms, always try to wear gloves. They can be cotton gloves, they can be nitrile, latex, whatever you're most comfortable with, but there are oils on everyone's hands that can interact with photochemicals. In some old photos, you can even see like where a thumbprint was, where someone was like holding it, and it's just the oil was left on there, so it just reacted and even left that mark. When you can, you want to encase your photos, prints, and negatives with some sort of mylar, and then keeping them in an opaque folder, because that'll help prevent any sort of light damage. Daguerreotypes, lantern slides, tin types, they'll maybe need a little bit more protection because they are more fragile, especially some of the like glass plate negatives that exist. Just like glass, you want to offer some sort of buffering, but that archival stock that you can get, just like the encapsulation of books, you can use those for things like glass negatives. With all photos, you really want to minimize light exposure, especially for negatives, just because they can be much more sensitive and you don't want to have that sort of breakdown. With digitizing photos, that creates a really good way to save them. Just prevent staying ahead of the decay and having that additional option of accessing them. And then especially with photographs, metadata is super, super important. If you are writing on the backs of photos, it's better. Writing on the front, you definitely don't want to write on the photo itself. If you're writing in the back, that's one way to do it. But if you can keep a separate sheet with the photograph and write on that, that is going to be a lot better. Photo paper is just very precarious, and there were so many manufacturers. There's a lot of variation with how some react. I've seen some where the writing on the back is fine. I've seen some where the writing on the back is completely smudged off. I've seen some where it's almost like you can see the ink trying to come through on the photograph, so it really just depends. But to be especially cautious, writing all that data on a separate piece of paper and keeping the photo near that is going to be a much more stable option and allow your photographs to last a lot longer. With AV materials, if you don't have the opportunity to get them digitized working with a vendor or anything like that, the best thing you can do in the meantime is store them in a cool, dry, and stable environment, especially for tapes when they can have a plastic shell. That's going to be a case such as these, not those sort of like paper sliding ones, because that external plastic protective case will keep the VHS or cassette tape much more safe. If the tape body itself is cracked, you run the risk of the film inside getting damaged. So that's why you want to offer that additional protection. Any of the tapes that you see, whether it's cassette, VHS, if you have old reels of tape, you don't really want to be touching that with your hand. That's another example of where you want to be using gloves, but never try to remove the tape out of a VHS or a cassette yourself. It's a great way to damage your stuff. And always try to avoid having any electronics near these. Magnetic tape is what they were used to record. So magnets can really interfere with and actually alter some of the storage. So when you get some weird warping or some loss, sometimes it's just because someone had an electronic in the box with a bunch of tapes. And just like everything else, you want to minimize your light exposure. Artwork and objects, this is kind of like scrapbooks, and depending on the size and nature of the item, you're going to have to kind of get creative with how you want to preserve and conserve those. If they're framed awards like those, and the framing is actually offering support to the item, you're better off leaving it in that frame than trying to extract it and put it in some other thing. As long as you don't see any sort of like mold, moisture growing within that frame, or if the frame itself hasn't been damaged, you don't need to interfere with how it was originally framed. And then when you can, keeping things wrapped in like acid-free paper and storing them in archival Mylar bags creates that barrier, because they're not going to necessarily fit in a folder like a piece of paper, but like an archival bag will prevent, if there are creatures that try to get in, it's going to be a lot harder for them to eat through that plastic than if you just leave something in a box. And one thing I always like to remind people with When you're storing objects, always be aware of how heavy they are, because if you have, 5 big framed things and you stack them all in one box, suddenly you have a 30-pound box, and you just thinking about that mishandling thing, it's really easy to accidentally drop a 30. But I have a bad back, so for me, I'm like, I'd rather have 5-pound boxes that are much easier to move than one big 25-pound box, because I'm way less likely to damage a lighter box because I can just control it and move it with a lot more care. And then with textiles, I talked about this a little bit, but whenever you can, when you go to store any textiles, try to make sure they're clean. It'll help them last a whole lot longer. But sometimes cleaning them does run that risk of damage. Like, you don't necessarily just want to use your washing machine and just throw it in and hope for the best. You can work with specialized conservators who can work with you to help get your textiles preserved and cleaned in a proper manner. You do want to try to wrap the items, again, with some sort of paper that'll help prevent anything getting through, and again, with that Mylar bag. Sometimes with clothes, there aren't always bags that want to fit around, or if you have like a quilt or anything like that, you don't want to necessarily just like shove it in a bag just for the hope of preventing something else getting into it, and trying to force it into a container it doesn't want to fit in, you can do some damage. So again, you're going to have to, just like objects, get a little creative. But when you can, try storing the items separately so you don't run into the issue of entangling. So if you have like a uniform and it has buttons and you're trying to store it in one sort of container with, a quilt, those buttons could snag on that quilt and then you're running damage. So when you can keep things separated, you definitely want to keep them separated just for their own safety and so they don't damage each other. Now with protecting digital treasures, sometimes I think folks hear digitization and they think it's like a catch-all that'll just save everything, but digital records do still need a lot of maintenance and protection as well. So that backup of whenever you can, keeping your files backed up in various locations. If you have an external hard drive that's 2 terabytes, do regular cleanups and backups of your files. Just make sure you always have them on, because if the disk on your computer goes bad, you at least have another hard disk of storage where those materials are. Creating duplicate records, keeping one backed up in a cloud, because if your computer gets hit and your disk somehow takes damage, you at least have that additional backup in that cloud location. Creating even paper copies. If it's a lot of documents and you print out the documents that you have, you now at least still have a physical record of those digital files. So it may not be the exact same, but something is sometimes better than nothing, especially with your family treasures. If it was, a really important email or a really specific photograph, having some access to that record can mean a whole lot for someone. And then updating your items too, that can be quite important. Sometimes that file corruption and data loss could happen just because people aren't necessarily maintaining and keeping their materials up to date. So if your computer did a software update and now your documents aren't being read, that can create a lot of problems, but ensuring you have those backups and are keeping your things up to date before any transferring goes on helps keep them safer. So keeping your devices up to date, creating the backups prior to any sort of update, and then ensuring that you have that compatibility beforehand. So like if you have, let's say, like a Microsoft Word document, those are great examples because they tend to be pretty stable. They can convert pretty well, but if you were using some proprietary software maybe 10 years ago and you saved a Word document in that file extension might not always work as well. So keeping those different versions and all that backed up definitely helps. For digital, generally, the backup rule is referred to as 3-2-1. You have 3 copies in at least 2 different places with the 1 original. And then here, normally I'll click through the links, but for the sake of time, these are just some great resources that are all online. The Northeast Document Conservation Center's website is fantastic. If you have preservation questions about specific items, they have entire pages dedicated to it, so you can go through that. The Library of Congress also has a whole preservation web page and site, all dedicated to, they have like a whole page that's just photographs, and it goes through different types of photographs and how you can do that. National Archives, Society of American Archivists, and even Gaylord and University Products, they have some like just how-to videos, so you can watch someone go through the process of how you would preserve something, and I'm a bit of a visual learner, so I always appreciate those. I've personally referenced these myself while processing collections, and they're really great resources. And I'll go through this a little quicker, just in the sake of time. Like I mentioned at the start, you went through all this effort of identifying your treasures, making your plans and backup plans, preserving all your materials, all this work for what? Hopefully so that you can share your family treasures. So how you want to share your family treasures and, handling them that way, you want to still be careful, but also displaying them. Do you want to do an in-person event with your family, or is it going to maybe be an online web page where you host these things? Sharing your materials is also a great way to keep your ongoing maintenance going. Collections do need maintenance. Once you process them, that's not the end of the story, sadly. It allows you to review and revisit your materials, and in doing that, that's where you can kind of catch where it's, hey, this wasn't this way before. Now I'm seeing an issue on this page over here. You can identify those problems before it creates a bigger issue throughout the collection. Generally, a used collection tends to be a lot more healthy because you're interacting with it regularly and seeing any issues that may emerge. It's also a great time to go through your weeding, which is just a fancy word of, is there something that does not need to stay in this collection of materials? Is it potentially risking the other materials? So I've heard it as quote-unquote threatening materials, but if you have one book that has some mold starting, you'd want to isolate that one out because the mold can then hop through other books. Now you're having a bigger issue across your entire collection. Sometimes people want to have 10 of the exact same photograph. You may, in 5 years realize maybe we don't need 10 copies of that photograph. Weeding it out can kind of help clear up space so you have more space to add new things, but also just keep your overall collection much healthier. Because sometimes you may find this one thing just does not need to stay with your materials, and rather than investing time, effort, money, all that into these things, it might be worth it to just removing it. And then you also may be getting it ready for donations, whether to institution or other family members. So with books, whenever you can, you just want to make sure they're supported. Old books, their bindings start to just fail, and they just need a lot more support. So what that one's sitting in is this foam cradle. You'll see those a lot in archives and museums that work with rare books. It's just a way to support them. Don't try to force books on or off shelves. That's where you can get a lot of damage. Whenever you can, you want to try to hold the book by its covers more securely, not just pulling through with one finger, because that's how you can pull pages and rip spines and things like that. And then flipping through them very gently is a great way to catch if there's any sort of like bookworms hiding around or anything like that. Paper is very similar. You want to handle it gently. Just like with the books, you actually want to avoid wearing cloth gloves. You lose a lot of feeling in your hands that way, and then you're more likely to rip a page, to be 100% honest. And yeah, keeping them flat still, and keeping them in that Mylar sleeves will just help them last longer. Digitizing photos can actually be a great way to share them because it's a lot easier to send a link to someone of photographs than it is to mail a bunch of photographs. Photographs, unlike regular paper, you do want to wear gloves still. And whenever possible, don't mount photos with adhesives directly. Those sort of like corner mount things that you can just slip into the corners are great for photographs. AV, if they're digitized, just like with photographs, it's a great way to share them. It's much easier to send a video file electronically than sending tapes through the mail. And then whenever you can, if you do still have the physical media and you want to hold that treasure on physical media, try to get high quality media players. Some like cheap cassette players that you find through various sources can often run the risk of damaging your tapes just because they're not engineered to the same level for feeding through the tapes as carefully. With objects and arts, just like museums, you just want to make sure everything is hanging and mounted very securely so that they don't accidentally get knocked. Whenever you're hanging something, always make sure you're using the appropriate hardware and make sure you double check weight limits. You don't want to hang something up and realize whatever you use to mount it can't support the weight of that. There's this thing called museum putty you can find too for like if you have objects. You can put it on the bottom and it just holds an item without leaving any sort of residue or damage. Whenever possible, you do want to handle them with gloves just for safety for the items itself. Always use 2 hands, and if you need assistance, ask for help. And then with textiles, again, keeping them clean. And you want to hang items very carefully in a way that doesn't necessarily like puncture the fabrics or anything like that. And making sure you have like padded hangers. So your basic plastic hangers can sometimes stress fibers. Offering a little bit more surface area for something to hang off of gives it a little more support. And whenever you can use mannequins, that's also really great because, again, it's that idea of supporting the cloth, not just letting it totally hang on its own weight. And digital collections that you might have, hosting them through different platforms, there's a whole host of options, There's websites, blogs, social media. There's a whole lot of different ways that you can do that. It'll be up to you whether you decide to keep a collection private or go ahead and let the public see that, depending what you have. But one thing with uploading or hosting anything, I always like to remind people, like, just be mindful of any sort of user agreements that you maybe are just hitting accept to. A company who offers hosting your materials may have certain stipulations that say, like, we can then now use your materials, or like you give up your rights. So just be very careful with that sort of language and read through, depending on what you're trying to host. And I just included a little shout out to Digital Maryland. We work with them. They're a great example of how you can host materials online and make them accessible for folks to see and access. So, brings me to everything I said. I know they ran through a lot, so I'm sure there'll be questions. But yeah. So yeah, Staples may have that as well. So as long as it has that archival marking, it's a rating of the type of polymer they use. So it has that, then I think it's P.E.T. I forget exactly what it stands for, but it's basically the makeup of that. So you don't get this sort of like strange discoloring yellow, so that those polymers don't break down. But yeah, you're looking for that archival quality. Yeah, yeah. If it was designed with that in mind. Like I said, not to say Staples doesn't have those things. It's just when you look at a carrier like Gaylord, they only sell archival material level things. Oh yeah. um, some of the stuff Gaylord has is very, very expensive, I will say. I mean, they also really work with libraries, museums. Like they're a primary vendor with institutions. So like when institutions have these, one-of-one historic documents and they need much more intensive handling and more care. It really just depends on what you have. So like the vendors like Gaylord, everything they sell is archival level quality. And yeah, I mean, sky's the limit for what you want to spend. Like same with like conservators. If you have, you can spend quite a bit in trying to make things safe. Any other questions or online? Yeah. Ooh. Yeah, so you'd still want to, like, a lot of conservators, you may have, like, there are conservators who, like, are specialized in photography conservation, so they can sometimes help with those sorts of situations, depending where that glass is. Like, is it a sheet of glass that can move, or is it, like, on a building? Okay. Spectacle. Yeah, so like conservationists can certainly help with that. So I don't have any like off the top of my head. Let me see that in the handouts that I have here, but that Northeast Document Conservation Center, they'll do consultations as well for not just institutions, individuals. So going through their website, you'll probably be able to find something for that specifically, and they can definitely either walk you through it of the sort of things they do, or even recommend like somewhere to go. Yeah, I think that's always the best thing when thinking about how much this stuff costs. It's, what is it worth to you? Dollars don't always tell the whole story. It's, again, is that really important document for your family that you really want to preserve and make sure it's passed down for generations, that can be really meaningful. And sometimes there is no price on that. Yeah. Hmm. Oh, uh-huh. If you can get a bag that'll fit it, just because, like I was saying, that plastic bag, if you think about like how, like if you've ever had a bag of trash get ripped through by an animal or something, like sometimes they can get through, but it does create a really good barrier for things getting into it. Because when it's just sitting there, any creature can kind of get into it, but it also preserves, having that Mylar barrier. If something spills, it's just that Mylar, so it'll just spill right off, not damage the item. Yeah, it's actually right there. So my email is ndemiro@prattlibrary.org. Our department email is spc@prattlibrary.org. I look at both inboxes, so whichever one you send it to, I'll see it. And just, put in the request that you'd like the resources from this presentation. I have them all on just a list, and so you can just click through the links that way. For something, if it's already framed and you're seeing the edges get dark, that could be a bit of the light damage, but it could also be, yeah, so it's most likely that light damage. Light damage is irreversible. If you can still read it, yeah, so if you can still read it, honestly, getting some sort of representation where you, either just make a copy so you have all the text always. Oh, yeah, I mean, yeah, so I'll even say, just to give our department another shout out, we do have a book scanner, and so if you do have larger items, it can scan those larger items. We're by appointment, but we can set up an appointment to help you get that scanned so you at least have a digital one. You can use like a phone or an iPad or any sort of thing that has a camera where you can get a good high resolution image too. With that, you do have the scaling question of any image you take will kind of mess with the scale a little bit. But that's just more so to preserve the text, because sometimes, I've seen pages that are so like blown out, you can't really read anything off of it, to be very honest. Keeping that text legible can be really valuable. We have some framed items here that have some light damage. We've worked with our digitization team to get a scan, and then our marketing team, who are great, they can actually retouch the photos. So that's kind of like an element of conservation, in that we're sort of trying to restore things back to the way they were, and then we can like create a recreation. Because we can hang those recreations back up on a wall, and we're not as worried about that light damage. We can always make another one. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and sometimes if they've been in their container for that long, that's sometimes giving them the support, honestly. So sometimes even trying to remove them you run the risk of like, oh, now it's all falling apart because it was actually being held together in that. Adhesive, yeah. Mhm. Yeah. That's that's where, yeah, so what you can do, if there isn't anything on the back, you can just, cut them out. That is one way. There are, just like with the steam for helping to release that, reintroducing a little bit of steam can make the glue a little more tacky, so it starts peeling. You do have to be careful that it doesn't start curling. So like I've seen where like you can take a piece of paper, because it has that ultra thin flatness, and you can even like wind it underneath and sort of try to like leverage it under. So there are different ways. if you're starting to like run the risk of actually ripping the photos off, it is sometimes better to just like cut them out. And that's where, while the photos are still, if they're still stable and good, this is a great time to get them, either scanned or somehow like creating that digital record. So if there's discoloration that begins from the adhesive, you at least had one representation of that. Yeah. Yeah, glue, it's not our favorite thing because there are like you can try to clean off the glue, but it's just once that curl happens, it's just like weird things with the inks and paper. So every situation can be a little different because I've had actually one of the scrapbooks here is that exact like it has that stickiness with the plastic. Some of it the ones I've seen, the glue is so dried out that the photos literally just pop right off, so it's great. Um, but it's not always. So it just being patient and just going slow one by one and like assessing each situation can be it's slow, but sometimes that's just what the items need. Anything else? Well, thank you then. Yeah, thanks for all coming out. And yeah, my email and like I said, department emails there. Feel free to reach out. You can also give us a call, anything like that. You know where to find us.